You never expect the smallest things in life to spiral into the kind of chaos that changes everything. But that's exactly what happened with my mailbox. At first, it was little annoyances. Those things you brush off because life is busy, and you don't want to think the worst of your neighbors. I'd check the mailbox after work, expecting bills, a subscription magazine, maybe a package slip, and sometimes it was just empty, even though I knew something was supposed to be there. I'd shrug, tell myself maybe the postal service misplaced it, or maybe it was delayed. But then, one day, my bank called asking why I hadn't responded to a notice they'd mailed me. I told them I never got it. Then my credit card company called with the same question, asking if I was ignoring letters about unusual account activity. I told them I didn't receive those either. Still, I wanted to give the benefit of the doubt. It's easy to assume companies lose things or the post office misroutes them. But the feeling in my stomach told me something else was happening. That feeling only grew when my sister called, confused about why I hadn't said thank you for the birthday card she mailed. One she had stuffed with a small amount of cash. I never saw that card. That was when the unease turned into a knot in my stomach that I couldn't shake. Someone was messing with my mail. Now, our neighborhood was tightly controlled by the HOA. Every lawn had to be the same height. Every trash bin had to be stored out of sight. Every holiday decoration needed pre-approval to avoid violations. And at the center of it all was Karen, the HOA president, a woman in her 50s who carried a clipboard like it was a sword and wore that smug smile like she just won some unending battle. She was infamous for berating people about weeds or barking at kids for riding bikes too fast down the sidewalk. But until that point, I thought her nonsense stayed in the lane of HOA rules. Mail, though? Mail is sacred. Mail isn't just envelopes and flyers. It's private. It's protected. It's literally a federal matter. The thought of someone stealing my letters felt so outrageous, so violating, that I almost didn't want to believe it. But then one morning, I happened to be in the kitchen early, sipping coffee by the window that looked out toward the street. That's when I saw her, Karen, standing at my mailbox like it was her property, glancing around with that guilty twitch people have when they know they're doing something wrong. She pulled open the flap, reached inside, and slipped a handful of envelopes under her arm before walking briskly back toward her house. My coffee nearly slipped out of my hand. I remember standing there, frozen, unable to believe what I had just seen with my own eyes. She was stealing my mail. She wasn't even subtle about it. She strutted away with that same smug stride she used when handing out violation notices, like she was entitled to do whatever she pleased. My first reaction was anger, hot and immediate. I wanted to storm outside, scream, demand she give it back. But as quickly as the rage bubbled up, something inside me whispered to stop. Because if I confronted her without proof, Karen would just flip the script. That was her specialty. She'd run to the HOA board, claim I was harassing her, maybe even call the police and spin some ridiculous story about how I was unstable. And because she had cultivated this authority in the neighborhood, she knew people would back her up. She thrived on manipulation, on making herself the victim, and she was good at it. If I went out there screaming, I'd lose before the fight even began. So instead, I forced myself to breathe, to step back, and to think bigger. I couldn't just react. I needed to trap her, expose her, and leave her with no way out. I remember standing by that window, pulse hammering, my fists clenched, and I thought, if Karen wants to play dirty, I'll play smarter. And that's when the idea began forming. Mail theft wasn't just a neighborly spat. This was federal territory. If I caught her in the act again and got undeniable proof, I could do more than just stop her. I could bring her down, the way she had tried to bring down so many others with her endless HOA power trips. That night, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the dark street outside, the mailbox just barely visible in the glow of the street lamp. Ideas circled in my mind like vultures. Cameras, bait letters, legal traps. For the first time in weeks, the helplessness I'd felt about the missing mail began to fade, replaced by something else, a cold determination. Karen thought she was untouchable because she wore the crown of the HOA. But she had crossed into something she couldn't control, and I was going to make sure she paid for it. I leaned back in my chair, a slow smile tugging at my lips despite the fire in my chest, because I already knew The next move would be mine, and she wouldn't see it coming. The very next morning, I woke up with a new kind of focus. The kind that comes when anger cools into strategy, when humiliation hardens into something sharper, and you realize the only way forward is to think smarter than the person who wronged you. I wasn't about to let Karen Clipboard Queen, self-appointed HOA tyrant, serial nitpicker of every lawn and trash bin steal my mail and get away with it. This wasn't her writing up some nonsense about my grass being an inch too long or leaving a garden hose coiled in the wrong position. This was mail theft, a federal crime, the kind of thing people serve time for. And if she thought her HOA status gave her immunity, she was about to learn how wrong she was. So I went out that day with a plan. First stop was the hardware store, where I spent far too long staring at the security camera aisle, running through scenarios in my head. I needed something small, discreet, but sharp enough to catch every detail. Eventually, I settled on a motion-activated camera, barely larger than a deck of cards, with night vision and high-definition recording. The kind of thing people buy to watch raccoons in their backyard, except my raccoon was a middle-aged busybody with a taste for other people's mail. That night, after waiting until the neighborhood quieted down, I crouched by the mailbox under cover of dark, slipping the little camera into the shrub that sat a few feet away. I tested the angle, adjusted it twice, even walked back and forth a few times to make sure it would pick up every movement clearly. By the time I went inside, heart still thumping, I knew I was ready. But I didn't want just a video of her snooping, because Karen was slippery. She'd say she was just checking for community compliance, or that she accidentally grabbed the wrong envelope, some lie that the HOA board, half made up of her friends, would eat up without question. No, I needed something undeniable, something she couldn't wiggle out of. That's when the idea struck me. Simple but brilliant. A bait letter. Something designed to lure her greedy fingers right into a trap. I sat at my desk, drafted an envelope to myself, addressed in my own handwriting, and slid inside what looked like a check, carefully crafted, complete with a convincing logo and watermark that would fool anyone at a glance. It wasn't worth anything, of course, but Karen didn't need to know that. All she needed to see was easy money, and her curiosity would do the rest. The next day, I tucked the decoy envelope into my mailbox, making sure it peeked out just enough to tempt her, but not enough to look suspicious. Then, I waited. The hours dragged on, every sound outside sending my pulse racing. Then, around 11 a.m., I heard the faint crunch of footsteps on gravel. I slid quietly to the window, careful not to be seen. And there she was, Karen, clipboard under her arm, sunglasses perched on her face, walking across the street with that same entitled strut. She glanced around once, twice, then made her move. She pulled open my mailbox, her hand slipping inside, and when she pulled it back out, the envelope was in her grip. Even from a distance, I could see the satisfaction flicker across her face. She tucked it beneath her clipboard like contraband and hurried back toward her house. My heart was hammering so hard I could barely breathe, but I didn't run outside or shout. Instead, I went straight to the camera. That night, I watched the footage, and it was even better than I had hoped. Clear as day, full color, high definition, Karen stealing mail from my box, her smug little grin plastered across her face as she walked away. I replayed it again and again, each time feeling the anger in my chest give way to something else. Triumph. Finally, I had her. But I knew better than to act too quickly. If I confronted her with just the video, she'd twist it, call it a misunderstanding, and somehow convince half the neighborhood that I was the crazy one. No, this wasn't going to be a screaming match on the lawn. This was going to be official. This was going to be federal. I spent the next 2 days preparing. I printed still frames of the footage, circled the timestamp, and labeled them with notes. I took photos of the bait envelope before I placed it, then after it disappeared. I even logged the times in a notebook, page after page of detailed notes that looked like something out of a detective's case file. Then I made copies of everything, one for myself, one for the authorities. When I finally picked up the phone and called the Postal Inspection Service, my hands trembled, but not from fear, from anticipation. The agent on the other end listened quietly as I explained what was happening, then asked me to email the evidence. When I did, He called me back an hour later with a tone that told me this was serious. Mail theft is a federal crime, he said, his voice calm but firm. And from what you've shown me, you've got a clear-cut case. He told me to. Day everything came crashing down for Karen. Started out deceptively normal, bright sun cutting through the morning haze, kids pedaling their bikes down the street, sprinklers clicking on and off in carefully maintained lawns, the whole neighborhood pretending like it was peaceful when, underneath, tension had been building for weeks. I had barely finished my coffee when I noticed the first sign. A police cruiser slowly turning into the cul-de-sac, rolling to a stop near Karen's house. Behind it came a plain black sedan, official-looking, the kind of car you don't notice unless you know what you're looking for. I did. My pulse jumped. This was it. I set my mug down and walked out onto the porch, trying to look casual, though my heart was hammering. Out stepped two uniformed officers, calm, deliberate, professional, and then the man in the suit, tall, carrying a leather folder under one arm. Even from across the street, I could see the flash of the badge clipped to his belt. United States Postal Inspection Service. My stomach did a flip. They weren't here for me. They were here for her. The three of them crossed Karen's pristine front yard, shoes crunching on gravel, and rang her doorbell. Within seconds, she appeared. Just as I imagined, she would, clipboard clutched under her arm, sunglasses perched on her nose though the porch was shaded, her mouth already twisted in annoyance, as if they were late for some appointment she had made. She greeted them with that condescending tilt of her head, the one that screamed, "I'm in charge here." I leaned casually against my porch railing, pretending to check my phone while watching everything unfold. They spoke for a moment, and I could see her expression shift from confident irritation to confusion, then indignation. She waved her hands dramatically, her voice rising. I couldn't hear every word, but the tone was familiar. Denial. She was denying, deflecting, trying to assert her authority. But the inspector wasn't having it. He opened his folder, pulled out the still photos I had sent, each one circled with a timestamp, Karen's hand clearly reaching into my mailbox, her smug grin plain as day. He held them out for her to see. From across the street, I saw her flinch, her mouth working wordlessly. She shook her head, then pointed across the street toward me, no doubt trying to spin this as some wild misunderstanding or personal vendetta. But the officers weren't looking at me, they were looking at her. Calm, steady, unimpressed. One of them even pulled out the decoy envelope, sealed in an evidence bag, the fake check visible inside. My check. My bait. Karen's face drained of color in real time. It was almost surreal watching her transformation from smug HOA president to panicked suspect in the span of seconds. Neighbors began to drift outside, drawn by the sight of police cars and flashing lights. Mr. Jackson from 3 doors down, folding his arms as he watched. The elderly couple from the corner, whispering to each other on their porch. Even the kids stopped riding their bikes and just stood on the curb, eyes wide, soaking in the drama. The longer it went on, the more it became clear. This wasn't some HOA squabble Karen could yell her way out of. This was official. This was federal. I watched her voice rise, shrill and desperate, her arms waving like she was conducting some orchestra of lies. She pointed at the inspector, at the officers, at me again, her words spilling out too fast to make sense. One officer finally held up a hand, calm but firm, cutting her off mid-rant. That shut her up, at least for a second. Then the inspector leaned in, speaking slowly, deliberately, his finger tapping the evidence photos. Karen's lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but the panic in her body language was unmistakable. She was unraveling, and everyone could see it. Then came the line that silenced even the neighbors. The inspector's voice carried just enough for us across the street to hear, "Ma'am, mail theft is a federal crime punishable by up to 5 years in prison and significant fines. You need to take this very seriously." The effect was instant. Karen's bravado crumbled. Her jaw hung open, her hand flew to her chest, and she actually staggered back a step like she'd been slapped. One of the officers moved slightly forward, steady, professional, as if anticipating she might faint or bolt. The crowd of neighbors erupted into whispers, a murmur of disbelief and excitement rippling across the cul-de-sac. Karen, the queen of citations and threats, The self-proclaimed enforcer of every meaningless HOA rule was standing on her porch cornered like a common criminal, and I was there for every second of it. I wish I could say I felt pity, but the truth is, I didn't. All I felt was justice. For the birthday card she stole, for the bank notices, for every smug smile when she thought she'd gotten away with something, this was her reckoning. She tried once more to speak, jabbing her finger toward me, her voice high and broken, but this time the inspector didn't even let her finish. He closed his folder, tucked it under his arm, and simply said something I'll never forget. "We already have the evidence. Your neighbor has done everything by the book. This isn't about him. This is about you." With that, the power shifted completely. She wasn't the accuser anymore. She was the accused. And as the officers continued their calm, steady questioning, Karen's voice broke, her shoulders sagged, and she looked around desperately at the crowd of neighbors, the same people she had lorded over for years, hoping someone, anyone, would defend her. But no one stepped forward. Not one. Instead, they just watched, some shaking their heads, some smiling faintly, all of them seeing her for what she really was. And me? I leaned back against my porch post, arms crossed, and smiled into my coffee cup. Because for the first time since this whole mess started, justice wasn't just a hope. It was happening right in front of me. When Karen stood there on her porch, cornered by the postal inspector, the officers, and the judgmental eyes of nearly every neighbor on our street, it felt like the universe had finally balanced the scales. But for me, that wasn't enough, because Karen wasn't the type to quietly retreat and learn her lesson. She was the kind who, even with evidence stacked against her, would plot, scheme, and find some new way to twist herself into the victim. I had spent too many months being her target to leave any door open for her to strike back. So while the inspector was wrapping up his warnings, and the officers were politely but firmly making it clear this wasn't a matter she could HOA her way out of, I excused myself and walked calmly into my house, my hands shaking only slightly as I reached for the envelope I had been waiting to deliver for weeks. Inside was the civil complaint my lawyer and I had drafted the very moment I caught her on camera stealing my mail. This wasn't just about theft, it was harassment, invasion of privacy, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and, thanks to a very sharp attorney, a claim for punitive damages that could triple the restitution. In short, it was the nail in the coffin that would keep Karen from ever coming at me again. When I stepped back outside, neighbors were still gathered, whispers rising and falling like waves, and Karen was on the defensive, flapping her arms, her voice breaking, pointing toward me again, as though shouting my name loud enough would somehow erase the evidence sealed in the inspector's folder. I walked straight across the street, my steps deliberate, the complaint tucked under my arm. She froze as I approached, her tirade faltering, her eyes flicking between me and the papers. The officers turned slightly, watching carefully, but I gave them a polite nod and kept walking until I stood on her porch, just a few feet away. My voice was steady, calm, the kind of calm that cuts deeper than shouting ever could. "Karen," I said, holding out the papers, "you've been served." The silence that fell was electric. For a moment, it felt like the entire cul-de-sac was holding its breath. Karen blinked, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She shook her head, tried to laugh it off, a shrill, broken sound that fooled no one. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice cracking. You can't do this to me. I'm the president of this HOA." But the inspector raised an eyebrow, and one officer actually let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. Because titles mean nothing when you've broken federal law. Karen's hands trembled as she snatched the papers from me, scanning the legal jargon with growing horror, her face paling with each line she skimmed. She flipped the pages desperately, her voice growing weaker with every word. Punitive damages? Harassment? No, this is harassment against me. But the neighbors weren't buying it. They were whispering now, nodding to each other, eyes sharp and unsympathetic. For years, she had bullied them with citations, threats, and fines for petty infractions like mismatched paint shades or a trash bin left out for an hour too long. Now they were watching her get a taste of her own medicine, and there wasn't a single soul stepping in to defend her. The inspector leaned in, his voice calm but final. "Ma'am, This isn't about your HOA. This is about your actions. Actions have consequences. And with that, he closed his folder and walked back toward his car, the officers following after a few more clipped instructions. The crowd lingered, savoring the sight of Karen clutching the lawsuit like it was a live grenade, her carefully cultivated image of power collapsing in real time. In the weeks that followed, everything unraveled for her. The HOA board held an emergency meeting, and though she tried to hold on to her presidency, her authority was gone. Neighbors who once tolerated